So I'm going to talk a little bit about open innovation, and this is a relatively new phenomenon, certainly in Europe. The pharmaceutical industry in Europe has done comparatively well over recent years. Many folk call it the, we were talking about it the other day with Furio, and he was describing it as either the cash cow or the devil, depending on your point of view, I guess. But nevertheless, it has produced new drugs for patients. It's done a considerable amount in terms of trade balance, producing 28 billion in 2007. It has been a major employer of scientists and has a real stimulus to the science base in Europe as well. But many changes have led to this concept of open innovation. And what's happened is the spiraling cost of new drugs, new drug R&D, combined with the patent life, the reimbursement problems, has meant that in many instances people are now willing to tackle much more risky targets, and that's in some way elements good for us and probably for the patients. So diseases which were too difficult to contemplate a year or two back now are actually on the radar. What also has happened is the rapid rise of the generic sector. It was a fairly small sector a decade ago, 10% of sales, and that's escalating year on year to 60% or even higher figure. Depending on which country you're talking about, it's much higher, for example, in the UK than it is in Germany currently, but I think Germany is going up all the time to rival the UK figure. And that's taken essentially a lot of money out of the essentially the sort of ethical pharmaceutical companies and pushing it across to generic companies who are often based in India and China. And in parallel, we've seen a rise of the Far Eastern science space as well, with lower costs. They've got a lot of new research sites and access to a growing market, whilst the European market is pretty static or declining, in fact. And it's quite interesting. If you look at the demographics, over the last few years, I can't remember, it is actually on the EFPAIA website, but I think Europe's lost 12 research sites in recent years, and interestingly, China's gained 12 in recent years, so there's an interesting parallel. I think for the US, I think there's a gain of 1 research site. But the cost of European in-house R&D is far greater than the global in-licensing cost. I think that's also an important driver. So the bottom line, if you like, is we've seen a loss of European research sites and science bases. So to combat this, or to adjust to this new sort of world environment, if you like, we have this scheme here. If we go back to the 1950s, we had a very traditional R&D to market model with companies having essentially everything under their umbrella. In the 90s, we saw the sort of competition from the biotech companies, the Genentechs of this world, a completely different model, ideas coming out of academia fairly quickly and being developed. And we're currently in this open innovation model where essentially the companies are downsizing and looking for ideas wherever they come in the world with no particular bias towards Europe, essentially. One of the interesting things people also talked about is the idea of reverse innovation. And this is the idea whereby drugs don't come from the developed countries, they come from the undeveloped countries, if you like, or the emerging economies, and essentially selling back to the developed economies. So this is similar, if you like, to the situation with electronics, power tools, and so on, where you buy all your power tools from China these days. The question is, in another 10 years, will we be buying all our drugs from China? In this sort of model, also, knowledge architecture is much more important than knowledge. Anyone can find knowledge, but it's actually how the knowledge all comes together is something that the industry knows quite a lot about, and unfortunately, under the open innovation model, that's not always translated across to the academic or even the SME sector. I've had this slide the other day, but we'll see it again. And on the right there, you see the sort of traditional model with the industrial research. And around it is a fairly large grouping of various functions, like going round clockwise, market knowledge, analytical knowledge, process knowledge, pharmaceutics knowledge, soft science, unpublished knowledge, patent information, and also the regulatory information. And all of that is pretty well managed by the sector historically. And under open innovation, of course, you're looking for more ideas coming from both the academic and the SME sector. And both of these sectors are largely lacking these translational skills, by and large, in Europe. And of course, there's quite a big difference there also in terms of the management of the academic sector, where there's not that overall management or the ability, if you like, of academics to interface with large numbers of groups. There's just no training for that, and it's largely absent. And so we're moving to this type of situation, as on the right, where industry is downsized, if you like. We have much smaller base. And the ideas are coming in from Asia, from the US, where essentially ever they come through best, and maybe from Europe. And one of the things we've been discussing at this lunchtime, and we have to put a plan together fairly quickly within the ETP, is how we adjust to this, and whether we need some extra instrument or tool to actually help this process in terms of translation advisors. And this is something which I've thought about for a long time, and but it's certainly coming to a head now as to what we actually do about it physically and on the ground in Europe. Can open innovation produce nanopharmaceuticals in Europe? And sometimes the answer to that, of course, is yes to some extent, but also my experience today suggests there's a significant number of problems which we've seen, some of them at this meeting here. And it's basically because that knowledge has not really transferred across from the industrial sector to SMEs and academics. I think I've done something to move drug safety forward, and many of the funders now put drug safety as one of the things for funding, and that was not true a few years ago. If, for example, the ERANETs now require people to state something about that as well. But many of the other criteria haven't been addressed, like the cost of goods, manufacturing issues, analytical issues. And these we have to address in some much more organised way. And then a likely outcome, as I say, is reverse innovation unless we do something about that. What can nanotechnology offer? Well, in the market it's not inconsiderable at the present moment in time. Not all drugs are branded nano for obvious reasons. But if you can ballpark it, it's given a market figure of about 10 billion. I think regenerative medicine alone is about 2 billion of that figure. And it does offer the technology to deliver large macromolecules or activatable nanoparticles to targeted organs or tissues. In many instances, these can't be done by any other methodology. And one can say, well, what's the advantage of this? And I think one of the advantages, large molecules can contain much more information content. For example, if you talk about the CNS, small molecules, to get them to do anything really useful in the CNS without having a side effects elsewhere is a real problem. But large molecules have that scope to do more interesting things and can multitask as well. Another example might be nucleic acid-based therapeutics, where commercialization of those is going to be very, very difficult indeed, if not impossible, without nano-based delivery. And that's something I think which will develop for sure. And of course, DNA or RNA or modified nucleic acids really offer a new frontier, I think, and we have some of the advocates of this technology in the audience in front of me. And essentially it's a new paradigm because it doesn't involve binding to proteins, for example, and all drugs today pretty well operated in that sort of way. And so I think for me, my feeling is that these types of entities will occupy the last available profitable drug space that's available, going up from small molecules to proteins to things beyond that. What's absent and what we need to put in? Often the science we're talking about here is really world class, but surprisingly, many of these skills, which I'm going to talk about, are missing in academia and SMEs. And one of the areas is the poor choice of applied research areas. And many people, because they don't understand the markets and the way the markets operate, choose to target niche market areas. And this is, you have to say whether this is, you have to consider, I think, before you start research, whether this is an area you want to go into, knowing that perhaps it is a niche market but has societal benefits. I think that's fine. But if it isn't got any real benefit to patients potentially, then that's a difficult thing. Peer review process often favours non-translation, and that's in part because of the democracy of the process, I guess, the academic involvement in that process, and that somehow new science is often more sexy or more interesting than perhaps more translatable areas, really. And as I mentioned earlier, academics are not used to managing large groups. So this lack of knowledge of how to move the science from the lab to the clinic is still a major problem, particularly with open innovation. Lack of translatability is a more important issue than the level of funding. Quite a lot of money has been spent, but how much of that is going to actually yield a product at the end of the day? I think that's the question. What are the differences between these two types of organisation? Academic groups are often small, intensely competitive teams. They have discontinuous funding, which is a real problem because they can run through and get to the point where they might consider a preclinical or a clinical trial, then the money runs out and they have to go back and get more money, which may or may not happen. Translational skills and functions are largely absent. I'm involved in many projects in the UK, and one of the issues there is sometimes people actually don't define their product at the outset. If you're going into development, then you have to have a very, very clear idea of what you're trying to develop and the manufacturing process. Academics have very good access to the literature, but less access to the soft literature, the industrial landscape, the patent landscape. And importantly, often the milestones put in a research project here are actually relatively weak and with no clear decision points. Whilst the industry has large interdisciplinary cooperative teams, they generally have got smooth plan funding to the clinic. The translational skills are developed in separate functions, and they both have access both to the soft and hard information, and by and large they have firm goes and no-goes, and sometimes almost too firm, but that's another issue. What are the translational rules? Rules are part of industry know-how and generally not published, and we talked about some of them, I think, during this meeting. I think areas like the use of silicones, these are rarely, if ever, been put into man in an injectable, and so give significant industrial and regulatory problems. And polymers also, I think, very problematical in terms of industrialization and getting them through to the clinic ultimately. And there are many other aspects. I mean, we talked yesterday about, briefly in a separate meeting, about the use of disulfide bonds. Again, these are types of bonds which are not really scalable as such. Which activities are essential, which are nice to have, and when should we stop? Is there a need for an intermediary in this whole process? Do we need somebody to help this transition, and who is it? And this is something which the ETP has to wrestle with fairly quickly. Pharma also operates in a completely different way to other sectors, and is probably less history of dialogue, and also a need for quite a lot of more honesty on that interface as well. And I'm going to stop my talk there and take any questions. I'm sure there are some. So, thank you.